Hello everyone, Professor Fritz back again. And this this short video is to help give you some guidance for reading the text for this particular module, which is called The Great Western Transformation. It's by Karen Armstrong, and it's a chapter from a book called The History of Myth. Karen Armstrong before we move on to the next slide, I just want to say, this is a crucial text for our class. In fact, this reading is sort of the anchor or cornerstone of the course. So you'll be dealing with this reading in a paper later in the semester. This reading will come around in the exams. It's kind of like like an anchor, like a pivot point for all the other readings, for a way to think about the other readings. So you want to keep this reading in mind at all times and take good notes when you read it. So I want to remind you also, again, that these sort of lectures are not a replacement for the reading. In fact, you won't get an understanding of the reading really without actually reading it. This is just to give you sort of a few places to stand, so you give you some traction in the reading, right? So you're not totally lost. Okay, so very important you read and reread this text, and also take notes, write annotations on the reading to make sure you fully understand it, and you'll have those notes to go back to. Okay, so Karen Armstrong, she wrote The History of Myth, a book, and this is the chapter we're reading. It's called The Great Western Transformation. And as you know, the West, as we said, is a sort of Europe and the United States, Canada, that sort of thing. So first of all, who is Karen Armstrong? Karen Armstrong is a woman of Irish descent. In 1962, when she was 18 years old, she joined a convent, became a nun, and she stayed there for about 7 years, but it was a bad experience, so she ended up leaving the convent. But you can see no one joins the convent unless they're very serious about their relationship to God, right? So her books and her work is primarily in the area of comparative religion. She's very concerned about religion and God and belief, which is useful for us in our class. So she talks about this thing called the Great Western Transformation. Now, there have been other transformations prior to that. For instance, the world radically changed with the invention of agriculture. Before that, people lived in forests or wherever, deserts, and they hunted and gathered. With the invention of agriculture, you could grow more food, you could store food, you could distribute food, but you had to stay still. You stopped roaming, right? You're no more nomads lifestyle. So it really changed the way human societies worked all over the world. Another invention that came up around the same time was the invention of the city, right? That's a huge transformation. Suddenly people could live in cities, which could never happen before, right? That's not always been forever, right? The new one for her is the death of mythology. And you'll see when you read it, she talks a lot about mythology, and that mythology has died, right? In fact, we don't even mean the same thing as what she means by it. So throughout the reading, you're going to see these two concepts in contrast: mythos versus logos. So mythos refers to the mythological, to myths, and myths in her mind refer to like feelings, intuitive knowledge. It refers to value and meaning and purpose in the life. They're sort of like why you do what you do. What's the point of your life? That's all very mythological for Karen Armstrong. Now, the common meaning for myth is a lie or illusion or falsehood. She means it does mean that today, but she means something greater than that. So one thing you want to keep an eye on is exactly what is she getting at when she talks about myth. She contrasts myth with this idea of logos, which you recognize as logic, right? So logos is referring to the logical, the scientific, the fact-based, the idea of practice. It's mechanical and buildable. So engineering is very much logos. Science is logos. The idea of based on facts is a very important part of logos, as opposed to, say, feelings or intuitions or value and meaning. There's nothing factual about value and meaning and purpose. So logos doesn't have much to say about that. All right. So these two concepts are built throughout the essay. So keep in mind how she uses that as she builds her essay and where she's going. Okay. The other distinction she draws a lot in the essay for a lot of good reasons is this idea of pre-modern versus modern. Now, you already know from the previous lecture what modern refers to. Certain sort of change in thinking, right? That had to do with science and the broadening of the world and travel and discovery, things like that, right? And also sort of backing away of the presence of God, right? So pre-modern still is defined by mythological thinking. And it's worth noting that Armstrong would put Christianity and the belief in God or resurrections or the belief in Allah or the belief in the Buddha. That's all mythological thinking. Now, there's stuff you can't prove, right? Stuff that science can't get at. Modern thinking is defined by science and technology, right? Scientific and technological thinking. That's the thinking of what you can do, what you can do with your technology, with your arms, with your knowledge. That sort of things are very familiar to us today, right? Like a mythological thinking wouldn't get you an iPhone. Modern thinking gets you that. All right. And then finally, the third distinction she draws a lot, less so, but it's still important, is rationality versus irrationality. Logos is rational, and by necessity, then mythos tends to be irrational. So the question you want to keep in mind as you read is, since we're moving in this modern logos-driven society, why does irrationality still appear? Where does it come from? Why does she think this is worth talking about? This you need to get at when you read, okay? Right. So I've already told you what she kind of thinks about Christianity. So where does that put Christianity? And how does this idea of mythology in the modern world of logos affect the status of the Bible? In other words, what does the Bible actually mean to us in a society that's driven and defined by logos, right? Right? So that's a question you want to think of as you read this chapter. Also, she makes mention this idea called higher criticism. This idea was that you could read the Bible in a kind of scientific way and try to figure out what's true and what's just bogus, right? What's just ridiculous and you can ignore it, right? So let's get at the core of what God's message is and stop fooling around with the silly stuff and the stuff that just no one can honestly believe, right? And so you're going to ask yourself as you go forward in the classes, what's the consequences of higher criticism? What happens? Is we get a better Christianity out of it? For instance, is it have any bad effects? Because, the goal of higher criticism was simply to kind of get rid of the superstition. Nobody wants to think that believing in Jesus Christ is the same thing as superstition, right? So what separates true faith from superstition? Higher criticism is trying to do that. But what happens when it tries to do that? All right. Another question you should keep in mind as you read this chapter is logos good and mythos bad? Or is mythos good and logos bad? What is Armstrong saying? And then finally, ultimately, as you read, the things you want to ask yourself is, what is the problem that Armstrong is focusing on? What seems to be the problem for her? The problem is why she wrote it. What seems to be the problem for her? And what seems to be her main point in relation to that problem? You should finish this reading, however many times you read it, 2 or 3 times, to have clear answers to that question, to those 2 last questions, okay? So she's looking at a change in society that was driven by mythological thinking before, and has now become a logical, logos-driven society today, the one you live in. And we know there are benefits to that. The fact that people live as long as they do is because of logos, science, right? But there are costs to that. And she wants us to make sure we understand the full range. And then finally, you want to ask yourself, I don't think there's another slide here. No, there's not. The last thing you want to ask yourself is, what is the solution she's offering, right? What does she propose? Yeah, what is the solution to the problem? Look for that. That'll be very important as well. Okay,